My name is John Deal, and I am an editor and historian here at the Library of Virginia. And I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to our talk by Dr. Donovan Schaefer, Nationalism and Cosmopolitanism in the Creation of Richmond's Confederate Monuments. One of the great duties I have here at the library has been serving as a liaison between the library and Virginia Humanities with our collaborative research fellowship program. And in that program, which again has been going on for about a decade or so, the Library of Virginia hosts Virginia Humanities Research Fellows for several months or longer to do what I like to call a deep dive into the manuscript collection here at the library. And it has produced an amazing amount of scholarship. One of our most recent fellows is Dr. Schaefer, who was with us in 2024 and 2025. He is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests include a range of topics related to the politics of emotion and their links with science, religion, secularism, and material culture. An author of multiple works, his 2022 book, Wild Experiments, Feeling Science and Secularism After Darwin, won the Ludwig Fleck Prize from the Society for the Social Studies of Science. A lot of alliteration there. During his Virginia Humanities Fellowship at the library, his current research and the subject of our talk today considers the politics of public material culture and Confederate commemoration. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Schaefer.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, John, for that introduction. Thank you so much to all of you for being here, taking time out of your afternoon today to have this conversation with me. It's wonderful to see so many people here in the webinar. I really wanted to start by saying thank you to a number of people and just institutions. So I was brought to the Library of Virginia with a Virginia Public Humanities Fellowship, which was just an amazing thing. It was wonderful getting to collaborate with Virginia Humanities. But I also especially want to thank the Library of Virginia, everybody there, all the librarians and archivists, John, you especially, for all of the work that you did helping me out while I was there. John, you said the point of this is to do a kind of deep dive into the LVA holdings. That's definitely what this is, but I will mention that I also did some research at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture while I was there, a little bit of work at the Valentine Museum and the American Civil War Museum. I'm going to mention some of that work, but mainly focus on what's at LVA in this talk. But I do want to send thank yous to all of the librarians and archivists at those places as well. So this project, I'm going to get into the weeds with a lot of the material that I found while I was looking through the archives of LVA, especially the Lee Monument Association. But I do want to start with a kind of big picture question and to offer a tentative answer to this question, which I want to be hanging over this talk as we get into some of the nitty-gritty here. The big picture question that I'm interested in with this project is, what do monuments do? Why do we have monuments? Why do they matter to people? Why are they so important to people? And why, in particular, are monuments, which on some level, when you look at them, they're like Christmas ornaments, they're decorations. Why do they matter so much to people? This image here, this is the Robert E. Lee Monument that used to stand in Charlottesville. Stood there for a little less than about 100 years, now melted down. This is the day of the Unite the Right riots in Charlottesville in August of 2017. So a lot of people know about this event when a gathering of far-right activists, white supremacists, converged on Charlottesville, ended up turning into this very violent scene. A counter-protester was murdered by one of these white supremacists who ran over a group of protesters with his car. What I find a lot of people don't know, though, is that this rally was triggered by the Charlottesville City's decision to vote to remove the Lee Monument. So several months earlier, they had responded to a petition from a high school student who asked for the monument to be removed. They voted 3-2 to remove the monument, and that was what triggered this response. So this is what I'm interested in. Why do monuments have the power that they do? Why are monuments literally a matter of life and death for some people? So let me give you a passage that I find myself thinking about a lot when I am thinking about this monument issue. So this is from a psychologist, a Princeton psychologist. He wrote this in the 1960s, but I feel like it's something that has a lot of relevance still today. What this psychologist essentially says is that we need to take shame and dignity very seriously. We need to see shame and dignity as some of the defining existential qualities of our life as human beings. So he makes this very startling statement with this passage where he says, terror is about life and death, and distress is about making the world a vale of tears. Yet shame strikes deepest into the heart of man. So this is a very strident statement. This is a very startling statement. It's very counterintuitive. He's saying that people would rather die than be ashamed. They would rather confront death than be ashamed. That's how powerful shame is as a motivating factor. Now, sometimes when I say this to people, they say, well, obviously that's silly. Obviously, people are more afraid of death than they are of shame. And a lot of the time, I think that that's true. But in the context of Confederate commemoration, this actually takes on very interesting valence because this sentiment of shame and fear or terror is actually something that has a very direct resonance when we're talking about Confederate commemoration. So some of you might know that Stonewall Jackson at one point coins this motto that becomes one of the defining statements of Confederate commemoration. So this comes in a letter during a military campaign. Stonewall Jackson is writing a letter to one of his subordinates. His subordinate has suffered a death in the family and is asking Jackson for permission to stay home and grieve with his family. And Jackson is browbeating him. He's saying, absolutely not. You need to come back out on the field. I need you here. And he says, what is life without honor? Degradation is worse than death. This statement gets remixed in a variety of ways in the history of Confederate commemoration. So it becomes a statement like death before dishonor, or it gets used at moments when Confederate monuments are removed. It even becomes a literal bumper sticker, death before dishonor. It's a paraphrase, but you can see it's the same sentiment. So this idea that Confederate commemoration is about this dynamic of shame and dignity, and in particular about a refusal to be shamed and a demand for dignity, seems to me to be something that is animating a lot of the project of Confederate commemoration. And this is something that is explicitly referenced in the lead up to the construction of the Lee Monument. So this is an excerpt from a speech that Jubal Early gives at the meeting that leads to the formation of the Lee Monument Association in 1870. And he says exactly this. He says, we need to vindicate our manhood. We need to purge ourselves of a foul stain. It's about this reassertion of the need for dignity in the face of defeat in the context of the Civil War. It's about a refusal to accept the degradation, the indignity that goes along with having to acknowledge that you were defeated in the Civil War. So what I'm going to talk about over the course of this lecture today are two strategies for asserting dignity. And these strategies sometimes overlap, but the way that I'm going to talk about them, they are divergent strategies that run in different directions. Two strategies. One strategy that you might use to assert your dignity, to reassert your status, is to appeal to your national identity, to say there is something glorious, there is something great, there is something grand about who we are as a nation. Let's call that the nationalist strategy. But there's another strategy available as well, which is the cosmopolitan strategy. The cosmopolitan strategy says, we as a people are part of a sophisticated network of cultured people who are plugged into global prestige. there are important things happening in the world of art, the world of culture, the world of literature, and we are part of that cosmopolitan world. So what I'm going to focus on over the course of this talk is how these two strategies play out in tension over the course of the creation of the Lee Monument Association. Now, I also want to talk, and I'm going to come back to this. This isn't going to be the main thing I'm getting into in the talk, but I am going to get back to this at the end. This is also very closely keyed into the way that Confederate commemoration is tied in with race. So the relationship between Confederate commemoration and white supremacism is complicated. I don't think it's quite as simple as some people like to make it out, but it is there. There is definitely a link. And part of what I would suggest, and this is going to really become clear when we turn to some of the Black responses to Confederate commemoration at the end of this talk, part of what I would suggest is that a lot of this assertion of dignity is also about the reassertion of white supremacism. It's about the assertion of the dignity of the white masters, and it's about the degradation of Black people in the South in particular. I'm going to read you a passage on the next slide. This is a very disturbing passage. This comes from a speech that was given by Julian Carr at the unveiling of the Confederate monument at UNC Chapel Hill, what we now call Silent Sam. This is a very interesting speech. This was unearthed by a historian named Hillary Green. It had actually been lost for a very long time. For whatever reason, it was not published. But I actually think that it speaks very closely to this point, that there is some relationship between Confederate commemoration and the glorification of white people and the degradation of Black people. So this passage I find particularly disturbing, but also particularly illustrative, because in it, Julian Carr is talking about a situation in which he whipped a Black woman shortly after the defeat of the Confederacy in sight of the federal garrison in Chapel Hill because she had insulted a white woman. And this seems to be something that is tied in with the history of Confederate commemoration in a way that a lot of Black commentators at the time were already warning about 150 years ago with the kind of beginning of the rise of Confederate commemoration. Okay, so that's the kind of big picture theme. For the bulk of this talk, I'm going to be speaking about the Lee Monument Association. I'm going to get a little bit into the history of the Lee Monument Association, and then I'm going to pivot to talking about how the Lee Monument Association used cosmopolitanism as a strategy for reasserting their dignity in the context of the aftermath of the Civil War. So, Lee Monument Association is really triggered by the death of Robert E. Lee. This happens on October 12th, 1870. Lee dies in Lexington, Virginia, where he had been the president of Washington College. They immediately rename it Washington and Lee University in his honor. Within a month of Lee dying, you have all of these calls across the South for commemorative societies to build a statue in Lee's honor, or to build a number of different statues in Lee's honor. So one of the things that happens is in November of 1870, you have a gathering of former Confederate leaders in Richmond. They come together, they give speeches. The passage I read you earlier from Jubal Early came from these speeches, and they set out to found the Lee Monument Association. This is on November 4th, 1870, so just about 3 weeks after Lee dies. But they had actually already been beaten to the punch, because a few weeks before them, the Hollywood Memorial Association, this is a ladies' memorial association, a group of patrician women in Richmond, had already gotten together to begin the process of fundraising for a monument to Robert E. Lee. So the Hollywood Memorial Association is a group that I've written quite a bit about and done a lot of research into. They are a tremendously powerful organization in Richmond. They're not quite at the height of their power in 1870, but this is a group that leaves an extraordinary lasting mark on Richmond's landscape. And their involvement in the Lee Monument Association does a lot to turbocharge the Lee Monument Association, but also causes a lot of problems for them. So this is the Confederate Monument in Hollywood Cemetery. The Hollywood Memorial Association is responsible for the fundraising. They hold a bazaar that draws in goods and vendors from all over the South in order to fundraise for this monument. They are, a few decades later, responsible for a plan to rebury Jefferson Davis in Hollywood Cemetery. Jefferson Davis was already buried in Louisiana, but the Hollywood Memorial Association is so good at what they do that they are able to persuade Jefferson Davis's family to dig him up and move him to Richmond and rebury him in Hollywood Cemetery, where they have a huge parade in his honor. So this is giving you a window into how powerful the Hollywood Memorial Association will become. They're not quite there yet, but this is the kind of group that they are. They get a lot done. They do a lot to transform the landscape of Richmond. Here's Davis Circle today. You can see they've buried a number of his family members in his vicinity as well. And notice these obelisks over on the left here. I'm going to call your attention to one of these in a moment as well. The Hollywood Memorial Association eventually founds the Confederate Museum. They get control of what we now call the White House of the Confederacy. And they launch a national campaign to have relics, as they call it, transferred to the Confederate Museum. It ends up turning into one of the main documentary repositories for the history of the Confederacy, and becomes a major tool for researchers pretty much ever since, although their holdings end up going to, I want to say, the Library of Congress or something. Their holdings end up somewhere else, but they create one of the main Confederate documentary repositories during this period. They think that they invented Memorial Day. They have all of these documents in their archives in which they try to establish their priority in inventing Memorial Day for the entire country. That's how influential the Hollywood Memorial Association is, or at least how this is disputed, but this is definitely a claim that they make, that they invented Memorial Day. Okay, so this dynamic between the women of the Hollywood Memorial Association, who eventually get called the Ladies Lee Monument Association, and the men of the Confederate Veterans Group led by Jubal Early, this dynamic defines the first 16 years of the history of the Lee Monument Association. And it is largely a fraught history. This dynamic and a number of other issues end up causing a lot of problems for the Lee Monument Association in the first decade and a half of its existence. So in the LVA holdings, there are a number of financial documents. These are books where they are recording their income. There are also a number of specially printed donation books that they would give to agents who would canvass across the South, asking for subscriptions to the Lee Monument, and they are embarrassing. They raise very, very little money. They end up they have about $20,000 each over the course of 20 years. That's not impressive for a 20-year span in this time period. So this is not, these numbers here on the right are not from this particular book, but they're fairly typical for what these books look like. They start out with a burst of enthusiasm, and then it fits and starts from there on out. And largely the fundraising is static between 1878 and 1886. So one of the problems that's happening, and I'm not going to read you this whole thing, Jubal Early has a lot of letters in the LVA holdings. They are very long, very angry letters in which he's railing against especially the ladies of the Hollywood Memorial Association. He claims that they have gotten in his way, that they are preventing him from governing and fundraising effectively. It's partly true, but really what's happening is there's a lot of confusion. So there are a number of different groups that are fundraising for Lee monuments. Some of them have very similar names. So the Lee Monument Association in Richmond is in competition with the Lee Memorial Association in Lexington. This is the group that eventually creates the eventually commissions and creates Edward Valentine's recumbent Lee monument, which is at Lee's tomb at Washington and Lee University. But these groups look very similar. They're both called the LMA. They have very similar names. They're fundraising at exactly the same time. They both say that they are in the game to create the definitive Lee monument. And they're drawing on the same people who would fund them. And so there's a lot of confusion. There's actually an amazing letter in the LVA archives where one of the fundraisers for the Lee Monument Association writes to Jubal Early and says, I'm having a really hard time raising money for your monument in Lexington. But Early wasn't raising money for a monument in Lexington. He was raising money for a monument in Richmond. So this guy who was supposedly working for him didn't even know what association he was working for. So there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of mismanagement. There are a lot of problems in the first 15 years or so, and things kind of sputter along until 1886. So in late 1885, you have the Virginia gubernatorial elections. Fitzhugh Lee, who is a nephew of Robert E. Lee, is elected to the governorship, takes power in early 1886. Just to give you a sense of how prominent Fitzhugh Lee is, this obelisk is just off screen in the left of this image. He is buried right on Davis Circle in Hollywood Cemetery. That's how prominent he becomes as part of the constellation of Confederate commemoration, and how effective his alliance with the Hollywood Memorial Association is. So this alliance becomes definitive in 1886. 1886 is when this whole process becomes unstuck. And a lot of it is about the two people mentioned on the bottom of this slide, Sarah Randolph and Fitzhugh Lee. Sarah Randolph is part of the HMA and part of the Ladies Lee Monument Association. And her partnership with Fitzhugh Lee ends up reactivating the Lee Monument Association and leading it to its very rapid success within just a few years. So I'll talk a little bit more about Sarah Randolph shortly, but what I wanted to mention for the history of the Monument Association is that despite all of the problems that they're having, they still managed to have 3 design competitions in which sculptors from all over the world send in designs for possible models of the Lee Monument in 1877, 1878, and 1886. These are high-profile affairs. The models are displayed in the Virginia Capitol. At some point, they're displayed at a gallery in Washington, D.C. It's a big deal. Judges are called in. The judges write their opinions. Prizes are awarded, but they also end up being totally irrelevant. The winner of the final competition is not actually given the commission, and I'll talk in a few minutes about why that is and how that happens. So by 1886, they have locked on a candidate. Their candidate is Antonin Mercié, who is a Parisian sculptor. They rapidly move to commission Mercié for the monument. In 1887, so just a year and a half after Fitzhugh Lee takes power, they have a cornerstone laying ceremony, and then 3 years later, the monument itself is unveiled. Massive spectacle. There's a lot of variation in the estimates of the crowd, but some people say that there were as many as 150,000 people in Richmond for the unveiling of the Lee Monument. That would have been almost double the population of Richmond at the time. That's how grandiose the spectacle of the Lee Monument unveiling ended up becoming. So the whole thing is a success. In spite of all of the troubles, all of the complications, all of the stumbling blocks on the way, there's a lot of skepticism towards the selection of the sculptor, as we'll discuss. But at the end of the day, all is forgiven, all is forgotten. The monument is seen as a huge triumph and turns into a national scale event. This is what the Richmonders had wanted all along, was to create a monument to Lee that would really put them on the map and reassert the glory and dignity of the Confederacy after the humiliation of their defeat in 1865. I want to call your attention to this full-page spread that the Times does on the cover. So this is an extraordinary image. They're using color, which is highly unusual for the time. They also have made this very distinctive design decision to have the images of Lee and various Confederate leaders, as well as the monuments that are coming up around Richmond, superimposed on the text. Like the text is secondary to the images of the monuments. If you look up at the top, you can see that they have actually reworked the logo of Richmond itself. So in the middle, you can see the seal of Virginia. On the left, you can see the Washington statue, which is the logo of the city of Richmond. You can see that on trash cans. You can see that on civic architecture all over Richmond, this little silhouette of the Washington statue. And they have added the silhouette of the Lee statue. So this is the level that the Lee statue has ascended to already at the moment that it's released. So tremendous success. This is seen as a definitive statement of the glory and grandeur of Lee. Checks all of the boxes, all is forgiven, all of the controversy is washed away with the success of this monument. Okay, so that's an overview of the history. For the rest of the talk, I want to drill down a little bit more into the decisions that were made in choosing the sculptor that they ended up choosing and the controversy that surrounded this. The main thing that I became really interested in while I was reading this material in the LVA archives was this commitment to a kind of cosmopolitanism on the part of the Lee Monument Association. So the way that the Lee Monument Association was understanding this was that they needed to show that Richmond was a cultural capital on a global scale. They wanted Richmond to stand alongside the cultural capitals of Europe, as well as other cultural capitals like New York. This is the essence of the cosmopolitan strategy. They are saying we are culturally sophisticated, we are reestablishing the glorious society that we had in the antebellum period, and it's part of this dynamic of reasserting dignity through these cosmopolitan sensibilities. So even as far back as 1877, when they are doing the first contest, they are making a point to send the notice of the competition to Europe. They are making sure that European artists, European sculptors are seeing the notice for this call for models for an equestrian monument. They want it seen in London, they want it seen in Paris, they want it seen in Berlin, they want it seen in Rome, and they want it seen in New York. This is an essential part of their strategy for tapping into the cosmopolitan international art world. This also leads to a kind of controversy. So they end up delaying for a variety of logistical reasons the initial contest, and they are accused of deliberately delaying the contest in order to secure the commission for a Virginia artist. Specifically, people are accusing them of wanting to give the commission to Edward Valentine. And they see this as a huge problem. They say, if people think that we are doing this because we just want to give the commission to Valentine, it's going to have major implications for us. We need to avoid the impression that we are just trying to give this to a Virginia artist. The judges themselves end up saying something similar. So there are a number of letters from the judges where they're offering their assessment, and a lot of them say the way that the competition was set up didn't give the Europeans enough time to respond. We need to get the Europeans in here in order to have a real work of art, which will put Richmond on the map as a cosmopolitan cultural capital. This is a major theme of a lot of these letters, is that there is not enough European talent represented in the competition. So the 1877 and 1878 searches are scuttled. It's actually a little bit opaque why this happens. We know that the women say none of the models that we've seen are good enough, but it's not entirely clear why. If anybody has seen other documents in other locations that clarify this, I'd be very interested to hear about that. In the 1886 competition, there is a winner declared. The winner is this guy, Niehaus, who is an American sculptor from Ohio. He wins the 1886 competition. And this leads to a lot of confusion because people naturally assume that the winner of the competition is going to be given the commission for the monument. That's what the competition was for. Even in the press, they report it as if they are going to commission Niehaus. And this leads to another one of these furious letters from Jubal Early, where he writes to the board of managers of the Monument Association and says, "This is spiraling out of control. You need to give me control back." The monument that they have commissioned makes Robert E. Lee look silly. It makes him look like an English jockey. And this is because this monument to him is not glorious enough. It's not martial enough. However, Early has misunderstood the situation because even though Niehaus wins the competition, the women of the Lee Monument Association actually have no intention of giving him the commission. He wins the prize, but they end up giving the commission to somebody else. And a lot of that comes down to this cosmopolitan imperative where they want to create a monument that will stand on a global stage. They want a monument that will show that Richmond is an international cultural capital. So this is where Sarah Randolph, who's part of the Ladies Lee Monument Association, really takes the stage. Sarah Randolph had actually made an arrangement with Governor Lee that the Ladies Lee Monument Association and the Lee Monument Association would merge. And she's very gracious about it. And she says, we're going to nominate 3 members. You're going to nominate 3 members. Our 3 members won't necessarily all be women. So they're not necessarily members of the ladies group. And in fact, they only put forward 2 women and 1 man, which in theory would mean that the balance of power was with the older Lee Monument Association and the Confederate veterans. But for whatever reason, what happens is Sarah Randolph almost completely takes control of this process. She completely gains the upper hand over the course of this merger. And Sarah Randolph is deeply committed to this cosmopolitan idea that they need a sculptor with international prestige, with international renown, who is capable of creating a masterpiece that will put Richmond on the cultural map. So this is where Antonin Mercié comes on the scene. Mercié had competed in the 1886 competition, but did not win. I don't think he even places 2nd or 3rd. And they actually conclude that Mercié's sculpture is not adequate. It's not actually good enough for the Lee Monument that they end up wanting to build. But they are convinced that he is the real genius of the group. And part of what they do is tap into this European art world network that does a lot of kind of word of mouth recommendation. So Sarah Randolph is in touch with all of these European art world figures, and they tell her, Mercié is your guy. Mercié is the genius, and he is the one that you should commission for this statue. She talks about this other artist who is in Berlin, who is doing this Monument of Luther. I can't resist this. This Monument to Luther still stands in Berlin. This is out front of the Marienkirche. It is riddled with bullet holes from the Battle of Berlin in World War II. The Germans made a decision to leave the bullet holes intact on this Monument to Luther. She reaches out to Augustus Saint-Gaudens, who is a French-American Irish sculptor who works in America, but who is very connected to the international art world. Saint-Gaudens tells her, Mercié is your guy. Mercié is the genius. He's the one who can make all of this happen. The LVA archives actually have the letter that Saint-Gaudens sends to Randolph, which Randolph then sends to Governor Lee. And Saint-Gaudens says this. He says, Mercié is one of the greatest sculptors alive. He's one of the greatest sculptors in France since the Renaissance. He's the cosmopolitan genius. He's your guy. So this network of letters of recommendation becomes totally crucial for the eventual decision to commission Mercié as the sculptor for the Lee Monument. Sarah Randolph, a little bit later, even goes to Paris to work more closely with Mercié. She's writing letters to Governor Fitzhugh Lee from Paris, and she's continuing to report on how respected Mercié is among the French. She talks about commissions that he's getting. She talks about how people are tapping her on the shoulder and saying, Mercié's your guy. Good work getting Mercié for this. He's the genius. He's the one who's going to help put Richmond on the map as an international art world capital. So this leads to what I think is the best statement from Sarah Randolph of her vision for this. She's talking about various works of art that exist in America, including other sculptures. And she's pointing out that a lot of them come from Europeans, or they come from Americans who were trained in Europe. And she ultimately says, genius is cosmopolitan. This is it. This is the heart of her motivation, is to show that Richmond is a cosmopolitan city where genius comes to rest, and to use the Lee Monument to put Richmond on an international, prestigious art world map, to show that Richmond is itself a cultural capital that stands alongside London, Paris, Berlin, Rome. And it works. The Parisians, the French, the Europeans are all very impressed with the monument. A Richmond official goes over to Paris to help bring the monument over, and he's writing dispatches to the Richmond newspaper in which they are celebrating the success of the Lee Monument in Europe. It is incredibly important for them that the Europeans are admiring the monument that they are about to receive in Richmond. Okay, so this is the cosmopolitan strategy. This is the cosmopolitan imperative that is in the background of the selection of Mercié for the Lee Monument. In this final section, I want to briefly talk about some of the pushback that this strategy receives. So one of the pushbacks comes from this other strategy that we talked about, which is the nationalist strategy. So remember I said earlier that when you're thinking about how to assert your dignity in the aftermath of a humiliating military defeat, there are two strategies available to you. One of them is to reassert your cosmopolitanism, to show that you are part of an international art world prestigious network. But the other strategy is the opposite. The other strategy says, we ourselves are glorious. We don't need to justify our glory with reference to other nations or to the globe. Our glory is ours. Our glory comes from our heritage, from our national identity. So this is the nationalist response to this cosmopolitan strategy. So already during the period of the Lee Monument Association, while the monument is being created, you have this pushback. So in 1887, an artist who had tried to get his model under consideration publishes a criticism, an attack on what the Lee Monument Association is doing. He sees very clearly that the ladies have commandeered the Lee Monument Association, and they are imposing their vision of what the Lee Monument should look like using this cosmopolitan imperative. And he says exactly this. He says they are appealing to global prestige rather than to the talent that we have right here in Virginia. This is this tension between a cosmopolitan and a nationalist approach. Even 10 years earlier in the 1870s, even though many people were saying, absolutely, we need to get as much European talent in as possible, there are other voices that are saying the exact opposite. They are making this nationalist argument where they say it should be someone from Virginia making this monument because only a Virginian can truly understand Lee's character. And because Virginia is already glorious. Virginia has a glorious history. There must be some geniuses around here somewhere. Why don't we use our own Virginia geniuses in order to make this monument? This is the nationalist counter-argument. So this argument loses in the context of the Lee Monument Association. But in the long run, this nationalist argument wins. This becomes one of the guiding imperatives of the creation of future Confederate monuments. So already in 1892, just a few years after the Lee Monument goes up, they are planning the Jefferson Davis Monument. And in the minutes for the Jefferson Davis Monument Association, they are making nationalist arguments. They are saying this monument has to come from Southerners. It has to be something that has a strong Southern flavor to it, including coming from Southern sculptors. There even comes to be a kind of nationalist interpretation of the appropriate materials for monuments. So at one point, the Davis Monument looked like it was going to be a victory arch. And in their fundraising circular in 1901, the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Davis Monument Association, they insist that they are going to use Southern materials in the creation of their victory arch. So this is how the nationalist argument ultimately wins out. Cosmopolitanism fades into the background, and this kind of Southern nationalism as a strategy for reasserting Southern glory, for reasserting Southern dignity, becomes incredibly important in future Confederate monuments. And with this, you see a shift in preference in terms of what artists get selected to a favoritism towards Southern artists, and especially Virginia artists. So this is where Edward Valentine and Moses Ezekiel and William Sieverts, they all become much more prominent choices for future Confederate monuments because they are Southern. Their Southernness makes them preferred options in this nationalist mood. Okay, so this is one of the criticisms of this nationalist approach, of the cosmopolitan approach. Let me close by talking about the perspective of Black activists and Black journalists on what's happening with Confederate commemoration. So one of the things that I found when I was looking through the LVA archives, the LVA is holding this painting, which is property of the Commonwealth of Virginia. This painting of Robert E. Lee hung in the Capitol building for many decades. This painting was bought by the Commonwealth of Virginia in the early 1870s. The decision to buy this painting was made by the Virginia legislature, and it was very controversial at its time, even though they did eventually buy it. One of the things that I found while I was researching this at LVA was newspaper clippings covering the debates around whether or not to buy this monument. So this is the Reconstruction era. So you still have a number of Black legislators that have been elected in Virginia. This is prior to the Virginia Constitutional Convention of 1902, which massively disfranchises Black voters. You still have some Black lawmakers in office during this period. And one of these Black lawmakers speaks out against buying this painting. He says, this is totally inappropriate. Why would we celebrate somebody who fought to preserve the institution of Black enslavement? And the white newspapers of the time cover his responses with this incredible condescension. It's deeply dehumanizing. And they're responding to what they perceive to be his insults against General Lee. This actually happens in two separate papers where they both use the same dehumanizing language to talk about a Black politician who is speaking out against this decision to buy this painting of Lee. So let me close by talking about another project that I've been working on that is related to this. This is not in LVA's holdings, but comes alongside it. This is a project I've been working on called the False Image of History Project, where we gather perspectives from Black newspapers going all the way back to Reconstruction on Confederate commemoration. And one of the things that sometimes gets said about criticism of Confederate commemoration is that criticism of Confederate commemoration is a new thing, but it's not. It goes back a century and a half. We have holdings in our database of Black newspapers for the False Image of History Project going all the way back to the late 1860s, early 1870s. One of the main areas where Black criticism of Confederate commemoration really launches is around this Lee Monument, is around the creation of the Lee Monument in the 1890s. The Richmond Planet in particular does this very interesting thing. They have their own coverage, but they also kind of make the Richmond Planet into a forum where they republish perspectives on the Lee Monument from Black newspapers all around the country. So they really stage a kind of symposium in their pages about the Lee Monument and about what they see is happening with the Lee Monument. I won't get into all of what they say here, but one of the most startling passages for me comes from one of the articles that they write. This is immediately after the unveiling of the Lee Monument on May 29th, in which they're covering what they see as really happening with the commemoration of Lee through this cosmopolitan strategy. They say, of course, the South will want to revere its military leaders, but they are going too far. And in the process, they are forging heavier chains with which to be bound. And this article ends with this incredibly bleak note in which they say they see what's coming. They see how antebellum white supremacist society is being reconstituted through Confederate commemoration. And sure enough, within 12 years, the Virginia Constitutional Convention has happened. You have this extraordinary disenfranchisement of Black voters, and Black voting power in Virginia is decimated for over half a century. So I won't get into too much more detail about that, but I do want to plug the False Image of History Project. My students did an extraordinary job with creating with writing essays about our database. This QR code, if you want to take a picture of it with your phone, goes directly to the article that one of my students wrote about the coverage of the Richmond Planet, where you can get a sense of how Black journalists were responding to this in real time. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate I've gone on a little bit long. Really looking forward to hearing all of your questions.
Thank you, Donovan. That was, I know I speak for everybody on the Zoom and a bunch of the comments about a very interesting and thoughtful presentation. And we've got some questions here. So here's one. Everyone who sympathizes with the Confederacy today knows about Edward Valentine and his work, especially the recumbent Lee. Do you think the sculptor of the Monument Avenue Lee is forgotten because he is not American, in a sense that a statue was somewhat hijacked to be considered a nationalist symbol and not the cosmopolitan symbol you described?
That's really interesting. I mean, the Lee Monument is iconic, but I don't think it's wrong to say that in many ways, the artist of the Lee Monument is kind of forgotten in a way that Valentine, for instance, or Moses Ezekiel sort of remains much more in the public eye. I mean, part of it is that Mercié only does the one Confederate monument in the US. It's not like he has a sustained career doing a whole series of Confederate monuments, and that becomes a major feature of his portfolio, as is the case with Ezekiel or Valentine. But I think the answer to the question is yes. I think that's a very astute question to say the cosmopolitan strategy fails. The cosmopolitan strategy ultimately loses to the nationalist strategy. And so the French sculptor it just is forgotten, just isn't as renowned as later sculptors who like are coming from the South and are part of the nationalist strategy, which ultimately wins.
Another good question. Have you considered comparing your findings for Virginia with any similarities in other states, such as Georgia or Louisiana, etc.? And then I'll add on, is Virginia singular? It's kind of a loaded question, in its idolatry with this Confederate statuary.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish that I had the bandwidth to do the kind of deep dive that I've done with Virginia for other states. I assumed when I began this project that I would be looking at multiple states. And over the course of doing the research, I realized that it would be honestly impossible. It's hard to overstate just how sprawling the culture of Confederate commemoration was across the South. It was massive. There were so many organizations, so many groups. At various points, they're able to get states involved, and the states create all kinds of institutions. With the founding of the UDC in the 1890s, it becomes even more centralized, even more institutionalized. And I wish I could do that level of kind of granular analysis for other states, but there's just too much. I will say from what I have seen that you often have a kind of combination of cosmopolitan and nationalist strategies. So there's a lot of flag waving when Southern materials or Southern sculptors are used. But there's also still this kind of constant reference to, okay, well, Valentine was a Southern sculptor born in Virginia from a renowned Virginia family, but he was also trained in Germany. And they like to mention that too. When they have Italian marble, they like to mention that they have Italian marble. When they have Italian craftspeople, they like to mention that they have Italian craftspeople. So maybe a more subtle way of making my point would be that the cosmopolitan strategy is not defeated, but it moves into the background rather than being prominent. Is Virginia special? It absolutely is, in part because Richmond. It's not inevitable that this would happen, but Richmond has the cultural capital to become the epicenter of Confederate commemoration. So the debate over, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture is now in a building that was once called the Confederate Battle Abbey. And in the 1910s, 1920s, there was a debate about where Battle Abbey would be placed. Was it going to be placed in Memphis? Was it going to be placed in New Orleans? Was it going to be placed in Richmond? The Richmonders win the debate. And they win the debate in part because of groups like the Hollywood Memorial Association, which have already successfully brought Jefferson Davis's body to Hollywood Cemetery. So the concentration of artifacts of Confederate commemoration in Richmond creates a kind of critical mass that makes Richmond the obvious location for a lot of this stuff, but that happens over time. It wasn't inevitable in 1866 that's the way that things would eventually go.
Since nationalism, seems to have won out over cosmopolitanism, have you been able to get a sense of how other parts of the country, especially the northern newspapers, the West, Midwest, how were they reacting in real time to these monuments, and especially the Lee monuments? Because Lee seems to have this national popularity, for lack of a better word, even during that time period. How were they reacting to this process?
That's an excellent question. The answer is really interesting, I think, because there's actually a lot of texture to it. So when you read non-Southern newspapers talking about, for instance, the Lee Monument, you get a kind of mix. So some of them have a kind of strong unionist perspective in which they say, under no circumstances should we be erecting monuments to traitors. But I would say that's not more than half of them. That's a sort of that's not a minority position, but it's definitely not a majority position either. A lot of northern newspapers celebrated the Lee Monument. They saw it as a triumphant work of art, and the Southerners, of course, loved this. But there's also a lot of debate, like back and forth debate in the Southern newspapers and the Northern newspapers about the propriety of a Lee monument. The perspective from Black newspapers is really interesting as well. I want to be really clear about this. The vast majority of Black journalists who are commenting on commemoration of Lee are very critical of it. But there's an interesting tonality to it where a lot of Black journalists will also express a measure of respect for Lee because they see him as virtuous. They see him as a kind of gentleman who successfully surrendered the South. And unlike Jefferson Davis or Jubal Early or Nathan Bedford Forrest or these other figures who were like, we're still fighting this fight, Lee was like, it's done, it's over. And a lot of Black journalists have a lot of admiration for that. And they will speak about the virtues of Lee. And even though they largely express wariness and fear towards the celebration of Lee, you get the sense that there's at least some sliver of admiration for Lee as a person. Great question.
I'm sorry. Do you think there's a preference among Confederate memorialists for marble and granite over bronze monuments? Is there a reason for that choice of material?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have tried to figure this out, and it's actually something I need to look into a little bit more. They realized fairly quickly that marble does not last. And so, I mean, if you go to a cemetery, you will often see very beautiful marble tombs and headstones that have massively worn away. And they realized fairly early on that marble, like especially for fine sculptural features that are outdoors, doesn't work very well. Works great for the recumbent Lee at Washington and Lee because it's indoors. But for something that's outdoors, marble like just doesn't do the trick very often. So they like granite, they like bronze. There's also an interesting history of different like metallurgical techniques and innovations that are being developed during this period, which makes certain techniques more expensive, but they're also new, they're untested. And so that dynamic is playing out. I'd love to learn more about it, but it's not something I have a good feel for.
Would you say that the 2019 monument Rumors of War by Kehinde Whitey is Whitley maybe, is a way to blend national and cosmopolitan strategies?
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's really well said, actually. Rumors of War by Wiley is, I'm sure some of you know, it is a direct response to the Stuart Monument on Monument Avenue. It's done in the same sort of disposition of the Stuart Monument that we saw at the very beginning of the talk with the Klan parade in front of it. So I think on the one level, yes, this is an American artist, but he's also an artist with a kind of global stature. So I think there's definitely something to be said for the fact that it's both nationalist and cosmopolitan at the same time.
So a couple of more questions. How does your work inform how you understand the passion around these monuments today? More specifically, passion for the Confederate commemoration than a critique of it?
That's a really excellent question. And I would say my thoughts on this are still forming.
Fair enough. Fair enough. A comment. Once somebody wanted a comment. Many parents would enjoy a children's book highlighting this information in a developmentally appropriate way. So there's your next project for you.
I'd love to write that. Anybody want to volunteer to be an illustrator?
I know, right? Okay. So here's our last question. It's a really good one in it. Do you think there's a class angle as to why Richmond cared so much about the international opinions of other nations when that doesn't seem to be the case necessarily for other cities? The second part, or is it that other southern cities care too, and Richmond is just a good example of this?
That's such a great question. Class is definitely a factor here. The women of the Hollywood Memorial Association are upper class or upper middle class women by and large. And so their own, and antebellum Southern society saw itself as deeply international. They saw themselves as deeply cosmopolitan and as having these networks with European fashion, European art, European culture. They expected much more support from Europe when the war began, for instance. It is partly about class, but I think the counterpoint would be that within just a few years of the Lee Monument going up, the same people from the same class stratum have largely abandoned the cosmopolitan strategy, and the nationalist strategy wins out. So I would say it's not quite so simple as to just line it up with class, but that doesn't mean class can't be part of the conversation. Definitely, if somebody wanted to come along and say, with respect to the Lee monuments, the Confederate veterans tend to be a little bit more nationalist, and they are less in tune with the kind of global upper class aristocratic society than the women of the Lee Monument, than the women of the LLMA. And that's partly where the tension comes from. I would be receptive to that. I think that makes sense.
Well, this has been an amazing presentation. I want to thank Donovan Schaefer for giving us the time today. And also, I want to thank everybody for joining us on the Zoom.
Thank you. And can I just say as well, please don't hesitate. I know we didn't have a lot of time for questions. I'm really interested in being in conversation about this. Please don't hesitate to send me an email if you have another question.
Thank you very much, Donovan. And thank you all.